This lecture accompanies your textbook, Chapter 15. We're going to focus on motivation and emotion. Motivation is one of the oldest topics in psychology. Freud was all about sexual motivations. Maslow was all about self-actualizations. And behaviorism was all about praise or reward as motivation. Current personality research focuses on goals and strategies. Goals are the ends that one desires, and strategies are the means used to achieve those goals. Goals drive behavior by influencing what you attend to, what you think about, and how you behave. One example is if you're starving. When you're starving, you're likely to smell food from very far away. You might even think about what you have in your kitchen at home, or you might pull out a snack in class. Another example, if you want to be successful in class, you're going to think about how you can do that. You're going to read the syllabus carefully, you're going to study for the exam, and you might follow up if you don't do well in the exam. Goals can also be inferred from behavior. So if I have a student who doesn't study and doesn't ask questions during class and doesn't do well on the test, then I'm going to assume that the student isn't motivated. However, that inference might be wrong. We don't always behave consistently with our stated goals. Goals can be anything. It doesn't have to be about one's career or school. You could have the goal of being a better partner or feeling more in control of your life. Those are also goals. We can think about broad types of goals, specific short-term goals, which almost always are immediate and represent something that is intended to be accomplished soon, or we can think about general long-term goals. These are goals that take a long time. So to become a better person, for example, that's not a short-term goal, that's a long-term goal. It's good to be able to shift one's focus between these two types of goals. You can think about them hierarchically. Being aware of long-term goals can help a person make better decisions and organize short-term goals. And short-term goals are needed to achieve long-term goals. So one example is you want to have a job. To reach that goal, you have to apply. To reach the goal of applying, you have to put a CV together. To reach that goal, you have to actually sit down at a computer and type up a CV. So you can see where being aware of the connections between specific and general goals can give life meaning and purpose. Funder gives this great example of how somebody approaches a task, whether in a different way if they're focused on the specific goal versus whether they're focused on the longer term goal of doing the task. So you have two people who are both cementing bricks together, and you ask both of them what they're doing, and one says that I'm building a school, and the other says I'm laying bricks. The first one is speaking to the purpose of the specific goal, and the second one is focusing on that specific goal only. And the benefit of the first approach is that there's meaning and purpose to a task where you are building a school. The second one, if you're only focusing on the laying of the bricks, it's less likely that you're going to develop a sense of meaning of that job, and you might even be less likely to keep doing that job. We can also think about goals as being idiographic or nomothetic. Idiographic goals are goals that are unique to the individuals who pursue them. And there are three different types of idiographic goals that your textbook identifies. Current concerns, these are ongoing motivations that persist in the mind until the goal is either attained or abandoned. So visiting a friend, saving money, losing weight. At any given moment, you probably have half a dozen current concerns that could come to mind. Personal projects are what you do. So whereas current concerns are goals you think about, personal projects are things you do, the efforts you put into goals. Finally, personal strivings are long-term goals that can organize broad areas of life. People can have strivings that are inconsistent with each other. For example, having a big family, but also having an ambitious career. These different types of idiographic goals, these three types, have some things in common. They're held consciously at least some of the time. They describe behaviors, thoughts, and feelings aimed at fairly specific outcomes. They're changeable over time. and they are assumed to function independently. This last property is important because it's a limitation of looking at goals in this idiographic way. We can talk about how an idiographic goal organizes a thought or behavior, but the goals themselves are not organized in a coherent way because the goals don't necessarily affect each other. This brings us to nomothetic goals. Some researchers have elected to focus on these type of goals because of that limitation to idiographic goals. Nomothetic goals are the essential motivations that almost everyone pursues. This idea is like the Big Five. People's unique goals can be organized by how they fit into a core set of goals that everyone has. David McClellan says there are three primary motivations. So universal goals that everybody has are a need for achievement, which is striving for excellence, a need for affiliation, which is finding and maintaining close emotional relationships, and a need for power, the need to feel strong and to influence others, seek prestige, and have status. Emin suggested that there are actually 5 goals that appear most consistently, and that includes goals or needs for enjoyment, self-assertion, esteem, interpersonal success, and avoidance of negative affect. Finally, another pair of researchers, not listed here, found that all goals boil down to just 2 dimensions, work-related goals and social-related goals. Carol Dweck and colleagues propose a different perspective on nomothetic goals. Rather than thinking in terms of needs, these researchers are focusing on the process. They see goals as being either judgment goals or development goals. Judgment goals revolve around wanting to judge or validate an attribute about oneself, whereas developmental goals refer to the desire to improve oneself. The idea is that these goals arise from a particular type of theory that one has, either an incremental theory or an entity theory. And it's said that people tend towards having either one type of theory or the other. Entity theories are those beliefs that personal qualities are unchangeable. And people who have an entity theory, they are more likely to have judgment goals because they don't see their personal qualities as being something that can be changed or developed. Incremental theory is the belief that personal qualities can change with time and experience, and this type of theory leads one to have development goals. These goals in turn can lead to particular responses to failure. So when one has an entity theory and therefore a judgment goal, they might have a helplessness orientation. So if they fail at a task, they will give up and feel helpless. Whereas those who are behaving from an incremental theory and have a development goal, they are more likely to develop a mastery orientation. So after they fail, they try even harder because they are hoping to master. Research has shown that judgment goals and development goals do lead to different outcomes. And there is an example in the textbook about academics, someone who has a judgment goal. If they fail that, they are more likely to think this test is stupid and not try to change their behavior or to understand the test better. Whereas someone who takes a test and has an incremental theory and a developmental goal, they will ask the question, what did I do wrong? And that will lead to mastery. Okay, but how do we get what we want? How do we go about achieving our goals if we do have a goal of mastery? Does personality relate to the strategies we use to attain a goal? Well, there's been some findings that certain personality aspects are helpful or harmful in helping us get to our goals. Rejection sensitivity is a maladaptive strategy of automatically responding to a situation with fear and hostility when there is the slightest sign of disinterest from a significant other, or there seems to be rejection, even when there's not. This is usually not a helpful strategy. For example, if your goal is to get help from a professor, but when they try to help you, you immediately become panicky that they're saying you're stupid, it will create a difficult interaction between you and the professor, and it will interfere with your goal of getting help. So rejection sensitivity is not going to be very valuable. In terms of choosing strategies, there's some research showing that people might be more oriented to assessment or to locomotion. A person who is oriented toward assessment will focus on how well they do things and the ways that other people evaluate them, whereas a person who is more focused on locomotion will avoid all distractions and focus on just getting the job done. People prone to assessment are more likely to be procrastinators. People might differ in whether they are generally pessimistic or optimistic about a strategy or a goal. There's something called defensive pessimism. This is when you assume the worst will happen and use this assumption to motivate goal-seeking behavior versus optimism, where you're just assuming that the best will happen. The idea with defensive pessimism is that you do actually find relief when the worst outcome doesn't happen, even when some things do go wrong. There are advantages and disadvantages to both strategies, but actually optimists are generally happier. Let's talk about emotion. Emotion refers to a set of mental and physical procedures. How the body and mind respond is part of the emotion. It's something you do, not merely a set of concepts or a passive experience. Personality psychologists have attempted to describe emotional experiences. They've outlined relationships between different emotions, explored individual differences in emotional life, and studied the implications of the emotional experience of happiness, for example. Research has looked at basic aspects of emotion: appraisal, judging a stimulus as emotionally relevant, a physical response, changes in the body, facial expressions, smiles or scowls, nonverbal behaviors, which include things like jumping or fist clenching as an expression of the emotion, and a behavior, how the experience of emotion motivates you to behave, think, or feel in a certain way. Some refer to these components, appraisal, physical response, facial expression, nonverbal behavior, and behavior, as stages, but stages can happen at the same time or in a different order. In the case of emotion. So physical responses could come before appraisal. Our body responds before we know why. The important takeaway is that emotion is a complex mixture of thought, physical sensations, and motivations. There are many sources of emotion, but Funder points out three: the immediate moment, a memory of a moment, or a combination of the two, which can occur with classical conditioning. A house where you have many happy experiences may lead you to feel pleasure the minute you enter that house. There are two ways or two paradigms that psychologists have thought about emotions. One is the classical view. This is proposed by Paul Ekman, and this is the idea that there are 6 basic core emotions that basically have the same meaning and the same expression across cultures. The idea is that some emotions, such as these 6, are universal because they were evolutionarily advantageous. For example, anger helps to activate someone to protect themselves, or disgust helps you know what not to eat. Fear helps you stay alive. This is the classical view of emotions, that each of these emotions is unique and they have a unique fingerprint. There is a more recent view of emotions called the constructivist view. This is proposed by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and this idea is that emotions are actually populations or conceptual categories. So the emotion of anger is really a population or a category of different types of anger. There is no single anger. There is no fingerprint for anger because anger is actually a population of different versions of anger. The movie Inside Out follows the classical view, and I have posted a critique of this a critique of this film and the classical view as a video on iLearn, which you should check out. Other researchers have focused on the broad dimensions that all emotions are organized around, and that is valence and arousal. So all emotions are either positive or negative, and they're either high arousal or low arousal. So we can think about emotions as being falling within these 4 quadrants: defiant and envious. These are both negative emotions, but defiant is high arousal, whereas envy is negative and low arousal. This is useful for comparing emotions to each other, but not for explaining particular emotions. To explain a particular emotion, it's necessary to examine the emotions one at a time and describe the emotion's basis and its implications. Funder refers to this as a functional analysis of emotions. So here he has listed an emotion and described a typical stimulus for the emotion and its associated response and a possible adaptive function. So one example here is guilt. If you harm someone else in a way that violates the generally accepted moral code, this is when you might feel guilty. And feeling guilty may cause you to apologize, and apologizing may lead to receiving forgiveness. And this is sort of a proposed explanation for why guilt exists and how and when it might arise and what the consequences are. In summary, emotional experience is different for everyone, and people differ in their tendency to experience certain emotions, the emotions that they want to experience, how strongly they experience emotions, how frequently their emotions change, and also how well they understand their emotions. For example, extroverts tend to experience more positive emotion than introverts, but extroverts also want to feel more positive emotion. They want to feel happy and energized, so they seek out those situations that will create happiness and energy. People low in agreeableness want to feel anger, so they'll seek out opportunities to express it. Intensity differs across people. Some people experience emotion way more strongly than others. Women are said to be generally higher in intensity than men. Feeling emotions intensely is a risk factor for bad outcomes like depression, and too much physiological arousal can harm the heart and the immune system. However, intensity of emotion can also help individuals be more sympathetic. Rates of change. People vary in how much their emotional experience changes from one moment to the other. Higher rates are associated with being described by others as generally fearful and hostile. So that means that those who are more likely to switch emotions quickly are generally seen as more fearful and hostile. There has been recent focus on emotional intelligence, and this is when you accurately perceive emotions in oneself and others, but it also refers to the ability to control and regulate one's own emotions. Dan Goleman is the researcher who's most known for describing emotional intelligence, and I have posted some videos on iLearn for you to check out if you are interested.